Dialogue at the Wilson Center is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And now here's your host, John Molesky.
Hello and welcome to the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Food security is something everyone needs, but many of us take for granted. And a critical element in attaining food security is access to land suitable for farming. Our guest today is Michael Kugelman, co-editor of this book, The Global Farms Race: Land Grabs, Agricultural Investment, and the Scramble for Food Security. The Christian Science Monitor identified it as one of 23 books it wished President Obama and Governor Romney would have read in preparation for their recent foreign policy debate. We'd be grateful if they just read a book before the debate, right, Mike?
Yeah.
No, that's quite an honor. It's an interesting honor, an interesting publication that has decided that this is an issue people should be talking about or aware of. And frankly, I wasn't. Not many people are. Why aren't we more aware of what's happening? And is the title cleverly tied to the notion of an arms race an accurate depiction of the level of activity?
Absolutely. I mean, just if you look at the basic numbers, over the last 10 years or so, about 230 million hectares of farmland, which is about the size of Western Europe, has been acquired by countries and corporations. That is a large number. It's a large amount of land. Now, much of that land being acquired is in the developing world, in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, some in Latin America. But there's also been some in Oceania, Australia, New Zealand. But to get to your question of why we haven't necessarily heard about it in this country, it's because, at least at this point, the United States is really not involved. The United States...
As a buyer, certainly not as a seller.
Either,
as a buyer,
well,
yeah.
Both, yeah. I mean, most of the buyers and acquirers, so to speak, are from East Asia, China, South Korea, and also from the Gulf. And the corporations are from Europe and also from Asia. There have been a few, according to the research, American corporations, such as Goldman Sachs, Harvard University, believe it or not, which has been a surprise to some people. But it's really not an issue that the United States is caught up in yet, at the moment.
Are those American corporations, are their purchases more investments, or are they actually for food production?
Mostly for investments, at least at this point. But you know, people who have been looking at this for a while think that could change.
But back to the measurements. Statistics are always hard to get your head around. The hectares is the metric measurement of land. How does that relate to an acre?
I think
about 2.5 or
something like that. Yeah.
So, the amount that's been sold, you say, is the size of
Western Europe.
Western Europe. So all of the countries of Western Europe combined, this is the amount of land that has been sold for farming around the globe.
Yeah, that's according to the research. Now, of course, as you can imagine, this is controversial. There's some places, some sources that say it's not quite that much. Other sources say it's been more. But in terms of the research that we gathered for the book, in terms of consensus views, in terms of those that have been doing the most work, that's fairly accurate. And we're not talking about land that's necessarily been bought outright, but it's land that's been acquired, leased, that's being used by these outsiders that are not, you know, the ones that usually use it or that don't have rights to it. So it's a large number. It's a large amount.
So one of the problems this indicates to me is that if we don't really know how much, and there's debate over how much, is that there's a lack of transparency, a lack of reporting, a lack of monitoring.
Yeah, I mean, you think about the players involved here. The people who are doing the leasing of the land tend to be very powerful corporations or very wealthy countries. And they're doing these acquisitions in countries that tend to not be very democratic, countries in sub-Saharan Africa most specifically. Transparency is not prized. The governments in these countries are not too concerned about the fact that this land is being used by local people for their own food production, these being countries that have major food insecurity issues. And as you say, there hasn't been much transparency at all in terms of how these deals are being done. There are contracts that have been produced, but they're very hard to get a hold of, and there have been some intrepid researchers that have gotten a hold of some of these contracts, and they tell a very troubling story. It's just there clearly is not much not much coordination with local smallholders in terms of they're having a say in how land that they may not necessarily own, but how they they use it, how that's taken into account when you have these outsiders preying on the land.
So they're just out of luck. When the sale happens, if they're using the land, they no longer have access to it. Simple as that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the case. And these investors in these countries do theoretically promise that these smallholders would essentially be able to work on this land. They'd get paid for this. But it's not really happening all that much. And there have been a lot of cases of people, local smallholders, being displaced. Essentially having to remove themselves off this land, not necessarily with guns drawn, not necessarily by force, but pressure through intermediaries in these host countries working with these outside investors.
Unfortunately, this sounds like a classic tale of the haves, the purchasers, exploiting the have-nots, those who live in these countries that may not have democratic representation or anything close to it. Is there a positive side of this? Is there one of the things that strikes me about your book is you really attempted to take a balanced approach and look at both the good, the bad, the indifferent in trying to quantify what's happening.
Right.
So what are the potential benefits for some of the countries that are involved as sellers?
Well, I mean, there are several potential benefits. One is that the developing world has a very struggling agricultural sector. It needs better technology. It needs more efficient yields. And these investments, if they're done right, can essentially transfer technologies from parts of the world that have more advanced technologies. These corporations can essentially put to use more efficient agricultural methods, put in place irrigation systems that are more effective and efficacious than those already being used. And in fact, many investors in public statements have promised that these very benefits will occur. But based on the research, it hasn't really been the case. I mean, there have been some isolated examples.
So promises unkept is what we're talking about here.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's why I probably should have asked this to you earlier and not taken it for granted, but you did reference it, but the notion of food as a security issue. Could you expand on that? What are the dimensions that move food into the security column?
Well, I mean, different ways of answering that. I mean, the whole notion of food security in the most general sense is that people, if they don't meet a certain level of caloric intake based on what they're eating.
It's about hunger here.
Yeah, that's hunger. That's the basic way of looking at food security. But you get into more traditional issues of security and stability issues when you have cases like this where local people use land for their food needs. Again, they may not own it, but they access it. And then if you have outsiders coming in and essentially making these people leave their land, then you have to worry about possible violent retaliations, threats to local security. And there have been some cases of that happening, of locals retaliating violently against investors, but also against nationals from these investing countries that happen to be in the host countries. So, I mean, it has different interpretations.
Is there potential for instability or conflict between nations as a result of this?
Not yet. I mean, at this
More
point,
within.
Right, we're looking at domestic instability. I mean, the major case that people point to when you want to talk about this issue, stoking instability, is Madagascar. A few years back, a South Korean firm essentially completed a deal with the government in Madagascar to acquire about 1.3 million hectares to grow corn and a few other crops. The people got wind of this deal and they launched a protest movement. And along with other grievances that the Malagasy had, it essentially led to the removal of the government that had completed this deal with the Korean firm. So it's the one example that people point to that this could perhaps cause political tumult. That's been the only case so far, but there are other potential cases as well.
The tip of the iceberg, perhaps. You mentioned corn. What are the typical crops, and is all of the land or most of the land used for food production, or are biofuels part of the mix as well?
Yeah, well, it's both. Biofuels are a significant amount. I think about 40% of these deals involve crops used for biofuels, corn, soy. But keep in mind, of course, that many crops can be used for both energy and food, and I think that's the major thing here in terms of corn, soy, maize. Wheat is also big for food, rice, and in many cases, local the main crops that are used in countries. Staple crops, that's the word I was looking for. So sorghum, some sort of smaller crops that we wouldn't necessarily be familiar with here, but are very important because they're basic essentials for local populations, but these are being grown by outsiders. And I should have made this clear earlier, when these outsiders are growing these staple crops, they're exporting them right back out of the country. Very
They're
rarely.
not selling them locally. This isn't a big farmer's market.
Yeah, rarely. That does happen on some occasions, but rarely. Yeah, these are essentially grown, harvested, and whisked right out of the country, which I find very disturbing.
Yeah, especially when you tie this to population growth within these countries that are going to have more and more food demands to deal with.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let's talk about where the action is. You mentioned that briefly before, but let's highlight this. Africa is the #1 continent for sale of land?
Yes, by far. Sub-Saharan Africa, we're talking Ethiopia, Sudan, Kenya, Uganda. Those are the major countries in Africa. But also, it's occurring a lot in Indonesia, the Philippines, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. And then, on a lesser scale, countries like Brazil, Argentina. And then beyond that, there's a little activity going on in New Zealand and Australia.
And you also, the former Soviet states and Eastern Europe?
Yes, exactly.
And let's talk about environmental impacts. What are the things that are happening that we should be aware of? Things like soil depletion, just use of water. We talked about the human environmental impacts, the potential for displacing food that could be used to feed the local populations. What are some of the environmental concerns to be aware of?
Well, I mean, there's a basic concern about the type of agricultural production done in these deals, which is very industrial, which involves exhaust belching tractors and just heavy use of water and land. But also, deforestation is a huge concern because, let's face it, there's a lot of land use changes going on, a lot of forests being torn down to make way for biofuels crops and for others. And let's face it, most of the remaining rainforests these days are located in parts of the world where these deals are happening. Again, I'm talking about parts of Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia. That's, for me, I think, is the biggest concern.
And is the level of activity at such that we need to be concerned?
I think so. Not today necessarily, but if
it's trending in that direction.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, really, in the last 3 years, I mentioned at the top that about 230 million hectares have been acquired in the last 10 years or so. Most of that has really occurred in the last 4 or 5 years.
So it's accelerated just in recent times.
Yeah, it is.
And why is that? Is it growing food demand? What is the reason for the acceleration?
Well, I mean, of course, it could be research. It could just be more people are getting wind of what's going on, and things may have been undercounted earlier on. But also, just rising food prices and population growth. This so-called global food crisis may have ended a few years ago, but it's still there's still a lot of volatility in markets. The drivers, the incentives for these deals to occur, have continued to intensify.
What about regulation, which is probably an overstatement, or at least attempts at regulation or setting up some sort of rules of conduct? I know in the book you talk about the World Bank and the United Nations and other entities attempting to bring some order to this mix. What can you tell us about any success in that regard?
Very little so far. I mean, as you say, the UN has tried to come out with a so-called code of conduct in which investors, countries, and corporates are supposed to adhere to certain regulations in terms of, working with local communities and trying to protect, taking environmental measures into account. But this is essentially a piece of paper when it comes down to it, or these days not a piece of paper, but
voluntary compliance.
Yeah,
no enforcement.
Given the players involved here, there's no incentive for these folks to be paying attention to what a bunch of bureaucrats in Geneva or wherever may be saying. So but what I think is more potential is for actual governments in the host countries to do more, to assert existing regulations on how land can be given out to outsiders. And again, as I said before, this is tough because many of these host governments are not, they're interested in these deals because they'll get a cut out of them. They'll be able to...
Classic corruption. These are not democratic governments. It's some...
Exactly. Right.
Dictator in charge who takes the money and runs.
Right. So unless... the key is...
Is there a solution here?
For those of us that have worked on this, we've had a lot of trouble coming up with an answer to that question. Until the drivers end, and again, and until commodities markets become a bit more stable, until food prices come down, if population shifts were to change, that's when we can think about this stopping. And also investors, looking at the corporate side, investors are notoriously finicky about how they invest in farmland, just because of perceptions about people thinking it's controversial and worrying about the security of their assets. If investors get cold feet, so to speak, and think that this may not be worth doing anymore, that would be a solution right there. But again, I don't necessarily think, given the drivers, I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Yeah, one of the things I enjoy about your work, not just in this project, but in the Asia program ongoing, is that often you put together a list of recommendations. Mm-hmm. You at least look for some solutions, and you've done that in this book. And I wanted to ask you, you talk about recommendations for investors, recommendations for host governments, recommendations for the international community. And in about the 4.5 minutes or so that we have remaining to talk about this, I'd like to focus on those, and maybe we can do it by category. Mm-hmm. You've already alluded to some of these, but let's go back to investors. What are the recommendations to make this entire world of transactions better for everyone involved? What are your recommendations for investors?
I mean, these recommendations are really stating what I think should be the obvious. Investors need to make a better effort to work with local communities, bring them into the negotiating process before contracts are signed, make sure that certain things are set aside for them, make sure that, well, above all, that if local folks have legitimate claims or formal claims to land, that land should be off the table. Otherwise, in much of the developing world, you know, the notion of formal land ownership doesn't really exist as it does elsewhere. There needs to be a more sensitivity of investors to these more informal arrangements. So local investors should really, or pardon me, foreign investors should understand that just because land may seem to be out there available for the taking because no one is actually sitting on it, doesn't mean that it can't be used. You know, in certain African countries, land is used for burial sites and not for anything else. And there have been cases of investors trying to use that land for farm production. More cultural sensitivity and basic common sense is very important in that regard. And
what about the host governments? Other than being more stable and more organized, what are some of the things that they can do?
I'd go back to what I said before. I think that host governments, there are some laws on the books in certain countries, Cambodia, Mozambique, that do regulate how land is governed, particularly how it can be allocated to outsiders. And those laws have essentially been trampled on. The government has allowed outsiders to trample on them. I think those need to be reasserted. The trick is how to give these local governments an incentive to reassert those authority over those laws. And also I think national governments in host countries should make a better effort to ensure, provide support, provide legal advice to smallholders to make sure that they're not exploited in contractual negotiations, which is happening across the board these days. So in a sense, these local governments need to be a better advocate for their people.
And the international community. Earlier you were a little skeptical about the impact that rules and regulations made by bureaucrats in other countries could have on the equation, but what are your specific recommendations for the international community?
I would look at international media issues. I think there needs to be more coverage given to these deals. And there has been coverage in Europe. We talked, though, not too much in this country. There needs to be more coverage to essentially highlight what's going on and really to showcase, or should I even say shame, those involved in the more troubling deals. And on the other hand, I think it's important that the media spotlight the few successful cases. Because again, as you said before, this book intends to show that these are not all bad. This is not an inherently bad thing that's going on. So if we can get media outlets to essentially spotlight the good that's going on, I think that would improve it would make the discussion a bit less polarizing. The problem, though, is that there's so little transparency with these deals. It's hard even for the media to really get a good handle on
where to focus their coverage.
Exactly.
Yeah. A final quick thought, Michael, is X factors that could either accelerate or decelerate this moving forward. I think of the potential impacts of climate change, for example, creating even more land grabs. Mm-hmm. What are the things you're looking at in that regard?
Well, I mean, let's face it, the effects of climate change are very clear, as we've just seen here in this country recently with Sandy. There's so many ways that already precious land resources can be eroded or destroyed. You know, sea level rise, flooding. Every time we have a major catastrophe, a weather catastrophe, much of it tied to global warming, that will then reduce even more, or could reduce even more, the amount of land that's out there. So yeah, I mean, climate change is a big factor here. And also, if there's another huge spike in food prices, which many people are calling for, grains have already risen. The price of corn has been particularly high lately, and that I think is tied into the issues with biofuels. But if there's another huge spike in commodities markets, that could be another big accelerator of this trend. In terms of decelerants, go back to what I said before. If investors realize that if it no longer makes business sense for them to do this, if it no longer makes sense for them to essentially acquire land and use it as an asset, then this may happen less. Because there are a lot of cases of investors acquiring land but not doing any farming.
Not using it, you mentioned. That's a very interesting aspect of this. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for drawing attention to us and for sharing your thoughts today. It was very enlightening for me. I hope it was for our viewers and listeners. And before we sign off for this segment, you got something coming up here December 4th at the Wilson Center.
Yes.
People who are hearing this program before, they can come and be part of a live book event here.
Yes, exactly. On December 4th, we'll be launching the book. So if you look at the Wilson Center's website before then, you'll get all the information. And it will be webcasted for those not in the D.C. area.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
When we return, we'll provide context on Middle East security from the Israeli perspective.
The Wilson Center is America's living memorial to its 28th president, connecting the world of policymaking to practical options derived from the world's finest ideas, research, analysis, and honest, nonpartisan conversation. Visit us on the web at wilsoncenter.org. And now we return to more dialogue at the Wilson Center.
The Arab Spring has been the source of much optimism for its potential to expand democracy in the Middle East. But have the sweeping changes throughout the region changed Israel's security outlook? This week's guest, Efraim Ha, was director of the Mossad and also served as head of the Israeli Security Council. He provides context.
I think Israelis generally have left the verdict open for the moment. There are many things in the Arab Spring which appeal to us as well. People democracy, people having the right to determine their destiny. But on the other hand, there's a lot of extremism here. We have to see which of the strands will ultimately come out on top. In the near term, I think the possibility of a normal conventional war between Israel and its neighbors has decreased. It's receded because the people are more involved in dealing with their domestic affairs, and secondly because the military forces are less prepared and less capable of carrying out offensive activities at the moment. In the long term, this might be different if the spring takes a turn in the wrong direction, and we become the butt of all the dissatisfaction throughout the Middle East. I think first of all we mustn't talk in generalities. The Arab Spring is a movement or a phenomenon which covers many countries with different strands and different cultures, and each culture has to be dealt with separately. It would be a big mistake, as it is often at the moment, to deal with it in total. That's number one. Number two, there are forces of moderation inside the Arab Spring, and those should be touched and should be encouraged. And thirdly, I believe that you have to be patient. Patience is a very, very important word here. And also, you have to treat people with dignity. One of the problems which has brought about the Arab Spring is the feeling of the people that they did not have dignity. And this is something which can be done not easily, but has to be addressed in a serious manner. Well, as I think we all know, the Iranians have not halted their program, and they're continuing at full speed ahead. They have not reached the point where they can make the breakout into the nuclear military field. I think they are feeling the extreme pressure which is being exerted by the international community, especially through sanctions. I think the economic crisis in Iran is having its effect. I think the regime there is finding difficulty in dealing with this. I think that the depreciation of the rial over a short period of time could play havoc with the Iranian economy. And this means to say that people will have less and less money and means to deal with their immediate needs, like food and so forth. And I believe what should be done is to keep the sanctions in place and ratchet them up as the situation develops. And also, my view is, there should be a channel developed to hold out a possible hand to the Iranians to find a way to, shall we say, to get off the horse, to dismount in a way which will not damage their pride too much. One has to be aware of the fact that this has to be done in a proper way with due respect to the culture and to the religion and to the other aspects of Iranian society today. I would say that one has to continue persevering in influencing the minds of the people at the top in Iran. I think the number one prerequisite is to find ways and means of convincing them that it's in their interest not to pursue their path they have been pursuing in recent years. I think it's doable maybe if it's done in a proper way. I think we've reached the point where the internal dissension amongst the Palestinians make it impossible to think of a permanent solution to the problem. They are hopelessly divided. There are two main strands, as you know, the Fatah movement on the one hand, the Hamas on the other hand, and other movements which are even more extreme than Hamas. And it's impossible to reach a solution with a divided Palestinian community. And I think we should try and do our best to deal with both sides of the equation. This has been my view all the time. We should not pass up the possibility of dealing with the Hamas, which has shown in some respects a lot of responsibility in recent years, although it has also shown other aspects of its more militant character. I think that something should change in the way we are dealing with the Palestinian scene in general.
New editions of Context can be found each week at wilsoncenter.org/context. That's all for this week's edition of Dialogue at the Wilson Center. Until next week, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Television and Radio. Our host's Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Molesky. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.